To New York.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
My pleasure. It's really good. Barbara's been talking about that, and I found it interesting. I did a lot of the research and so forth, but bear with my ignorance. I'm not a scholar of the early Christianity and so forth, but it's an interesting book, and the thesis is really interesting. And I'm looking forward to talking to you. Welcome to MNN.
Great. Thank you for having me.
And welcome very much to Conversations. It's a pleasure to welcome to the program Joseph Atwill. And he's the author of a book that's been out, I guess, a couple of years now?
No, about a year and a half.
About a year and a half. And it's called, maybe you can bring it in, you can see what it looks like. It's called Caesar's Messiah, and it has a subtitle, Joe?
The Roman Conspiracy to Invent Jesus.
The Roman Conspiracy to Invent Jesus, which is a very interesting subject area, and it's selling very well and so forth. It's a very interesting, controversial concept that he puts forth in the book. And it's a great pleasure to welcome to the program. And one more time, Joe, welcome very much to Conversations.
Thank you.
I wonder if you might share, maybe before we wade right into the book and so forth, share your own background a little bit, if you would, please.
Well, I didn't study religious studies in college. I was a business and computer science major. And I, in business, developed computer software companies.
Okay.
I was fortunate enough to sell them, and at that time I went back to a subject that had interested me for some time. I grew up in Japan and went to a Jesuit military academy for all of my youthful education.
That's really rigorous intellectual tutoring.
Perhaps St. Mary's Military Academy.
Yeah, okay.
And we studied the New Testament every day.
Okay.
They were focused on that particular, part of pedagogy. They wanted to make sure that everyone studied the Gospels.
Okay, yeah.
And so this just, even though as I went through life I sort of drifted away from the faith, I was very interested in it just from the historical perspective of how the religion began. And so when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, I began to study them to see if there was anything about them that would shed light on this mystery of the origins of Christianity.
The mystery of it. Yeah, okay, yeah.
And the real mystery is simply how a cult that advocates pacifism and of giving to Caesar what is Caesar emerged from Judea in the first century. Because in that century, there was a messianic movement that was the nationalist movement. It was the movement of the people, and we can verify that because it was able to kick out the Romans. In other words, there was a messianic movement in the first century that waged war against the Roman Empire for over 100 years.
What years are we talking? Are you talking first century BC, AD, or AD, right?
From year 1 through 135 CE, as it's called, current era. The entire era of the ministry of Jesus and the formation of the Christian cult.
Okay.
There was a messianic movement in Judea that was in constant warfare against the Roman Empire.
Would that include a Masada and that sort of thing?
Yes, yeah, exactly. That was one of the rebellions. There were 3 separate rebellions, and then there were many smaller skirmishes.
And these were rebellions against the Roman order.
Exactly, and they were national rebellions. In other words, they were able to seize the country, set up their own government, mint their own coins, and drive the Roman legions out militarily a number of times. So you can see that this was the nationalist movement.
They were able to drive them out of where?
Out of
Jerusalem?
Judea. No, out of the entire country.
Out of the entire country?
Yes, for a brief period of time, for several years. In other words, they, from 66 through 70, they were able to actually occupy Israel and to set up their own government and mint coins and have
I don't think there was in Israel. There was Judea and Samaria and that kind
They
of thing.
referred to it as Israel.
They did?
Their coins actually had the redemption of Zion and Eretz Israel.
Well, how that was Judaic culture, the Judaic culture with the Messianic and Mashiach notion of so forth. Yeah. And there were people who were advocating that there was a Messianic message in the air, as it were.
Well, the historians of the era, Josephus, Suetonius, Tacitus, all record that what promoted the Jews to rebel were the Messianic prophecies.
Okay.
So they were looking to a Messiah to lead them. And it's very logical. The Judaic tradition is that God will send them someone who will have his power, who will help them militarily. David, for example, you know, with his
Second Temple.
Yeah, the second temple. The power that David was given, that is the basis of the Messianic tradition. So it was very logical for them to look to a Messiah. And if you read the Dead Sea Scrolls, what you'll see is that they were in fact looking for a Messiah. This would not be a pacifistic Messiah. This wouldn't be a Messiah that would advocate giving to Caesar what is Caesar. Just the opposite. This was a military Hebraic warrior like David. So that was the religion that was actually the national religion of Judea during that era.
Is it correct to call it nation then?
They saw it as such.
They saw it as such, right? That's interesting because they'd been there a long while. And they had this tradition going back to Moses and Abraham,
Well, what you have to remember is that in the prior century, the Maccabees had set up a religious state. This was essentially taken over by the Romans, who put in their puppet rulers, the Herods. But the Maccabean religious tradition never died out. It was always in combat against the Roman Empire.
Well, the Judaic tradition goes back to Abraham, I think, doesn't it? Or to
wherever you want to, however you want to go back into to Adam, perhaps. But the actual creation of the Jewish state that we can verify archaeologically comes from the Maccabees. 167 BCE would be the time when they were able to kick out the Seleucids, who had been, they were the descendants of Alexander the Great that had been politically in control of the region. And when the Maccabees took over the area, they would, compulsorily circumcise all of the individuals in the villages of they were very religious, and all of their coins, their literature is all have a very devout Jewish perspective.
Yeah, that's a rich Judaic tradition. It's very rich in terms of a monotheistic view of the world. The West is based on that in a certain sense.
And the Torah. They were looking to the Torah as the basis for their lives.
And did the Torah, in the interpretation of the Torah, interpretations, Talmudic or Torah, did it give indications from those ancient writings and those systems of thinking about the conditions under which Moshiach would appear? In your estimation, did it give it?
I think that the best way to look at that is to look in the Dead Sea Scrolls, to actually look at how they were interpreting the Torah and the Dead Sea Scrolls. And if you look at the Habakkuk Pesher, for example, you'll see that what they're doing is looking for patterns within the Scripture that they can relate to the present. In other words, they're trying to determine when the Messiah will appear.
Right.
So the Dead Sea Scrolls have just a number of documents that appear to be looking or trying to find the Messiah.
Well, that was core. It seems to me, if I may, you forgive me, I'm not a scholar, but it was core to the Judaic idea, the idea of the Moshiach. That was something.
True, but this becomes more focused during the occupation of the region by a foreign military.
And more political, maybe.
Well, not only that, the Roman emperors insisted on putting their effigies in the temple, and this is in direct violation of Hebraic law. You cannot have the images of foreign gods inside the temple of the Lord. And so when Caligula put a statue right in the temple, of himself in the temple, then this just re-energized the religious Jews of the era to start trying to determine if they could combat Rome, and the Messiah was something that they would naturally look to.
Yeah, right. And there were probably other peoples too. Rome had an empire that extended out over a wide area. When you have an empire, you have people who were subjugated to the power, and it was based on power.
Well, one of the reasons that the Gospels
there would have been others up in Anatolia and so forth. Other
sure.
peoples, the Hittite. I mean, there are other peoples that would have had as chafing under the imperium of Rome.
Right. In fact, the individuals who produced the Gospels, Vespasian and Titus, they had, before they were sent to Judea to destroy the Messianic movement, and they were the individuals who raised the temple, they had been in France and in Britain fighting against the Druids.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
okay.
That's where they had come from. So they were, as far as I can tell, they were essentially the Roman religious scrubbers. They were the ones who came in and just got rid of religions that were in rebellion against the empire.
Would attempt to.
Yes, it took them. They were in Britain
I've
for
noticed
a
the
decade.
Jews are still around.
True. The religion that existed at the time of the Roman invasion of Judea does no longer exist. That religion was essentially extinguished. But a new Judaism emerged, but it was very different.
Probably the history of the world is that way. I did my doctoral dissertation among the Aymara people of Bolivia, and it's a foundational culture for the Andean area based upon the potato. They a unique food complex that made civilization possible. In about 100 years, and they extended their sway all the way from Bolivia, Lake Titicaca, up to Venezuela in an imperium. And they had control over the tribes and kept the unity and built things and so forth, and much like Rome did. And then they fell apart, as empires do, and then one arose about 100 years before the Spaniards came, or and they were called the Wari or the Inca. And they had a different language, different culture to a degree. It was called Quechua, but they could never impose Quechua on the Aymara people because that was an older culture that had been there.
Right.
But the idea of an empire trying to subsume other tribes and other villages and other ideas in that context is a good part of the human history is written in
Well,
those
the Romans
tombs.
were experts at it. The Romans
they were really
knew how to...
pretty ruthless, too.
They knew how to absorb the religions of the provinces that they conquered, and they knew that this would help them subdue and control the peoples that they ruled.
The many peoples that they
Of course,
ruled,
but they had a very specific problem in Judea because in all of the empire, they would permit any imaginable form of religion, but there was one exception. You had to permit emperor worship. You had to permit the worship of the emperor in all of your temples.
That's interesting, yeah.
And that was the point that the Jews simply could not abide with the Roman Empire, and that led to all of the rebellions.
So the rendering onto Caesar, what is Caesar's, onto God, what's God's, didn't apply in that sense? I mean, you would have a dual loyalty, a political loyalty
actually,
to the political
the
power.
gospel has quite a bit of wit in it.
Oh, good.
It's actually not a religious work at all, but rather more of a comic work.
This is your position.
This is my position, but I think it's very defensible.
You call it the gospel rather than the gospels.
Well,
Mark, John, Luke.
all of them are a unified piece of literature,
That's what you
in
say.
my opinion.
Yeah, right.
But in that particular expression, you have to remember that the Caesars were God. The imperial cult was in full force at this time, and when you say to give to Caesar what is Caesar and to God what is God, you're actually talking about giving everything to Caesar, because Caesar is God.
Well, Caesar was God in terms of, I see. They had gods that went way back in their own thing. I mean, they had Juniper and Juno and
we have to
gods
remember
and things.
The imperial cult was established with the death of Julius Caesar, and this officially deified the Caesars as God. And this became, in fact, the dominant in the sense of the majority of temples would be dedicated to Caesars as God. And so when the Gospels essentially have one question that is essential, which is what is the identity of the Son of Man that Jesus says who's going to come and lay low the Galilean towns, he's going to encircle Jerusalem with a wall, and he's going to raise the temple. Throughout his ministry, Jesus is always talking about the visitation by the Son of Man. He speaks of the individual in the third person. There have been various explanations why Jesus does this, but the fact is the Gospels are formed completely to answer the question as to who the individual is. Who is this person who's going to come and be the Son of Man, or the Christ? The Son of Man is a designation of Christ that Daniel used. And then he's going to lay low the Galilean towns, again, circle.
Lay low go ahead,
This is a prophecy that Jesus makes early in his ministry when he's in Galilee, and he talks about Carpanon and the Chorazin, all of these, the various things that are going to happen when the Son of Man makes his visitation. These towns will be destroyed.
This would be the Mashiach.
Well, this would be the son of, it depends on how you would characterize it, but the designation that Jesus uses is the Son of Man. and he's using that expression from Daniel, and as Daniel uses it, it is related to the Messiah, the concept of the Messiah.
The concept of the Messiah.
Right, of the Messiah.
Yeah, right, and that's a concept that is still held. I have a lot of friends who are involved in what they call the Natura Carta. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Not familiar with it.
Well, that's a political-oriented kind of group over the question of the modern-day existence
Sure.
of the State of Israel, the Zionist thing that happened in 1948 and so
Yeah.
forth. And they have an interpretation, they call themselves Torah True. There's not that many left, but that was the attitude of all the Jews in the more modern experience. They were very much against the idea of making a nation state in the modern example, because in the main thing, there's a lot of things. They interpret the Torah in a Torah True way, they say, and it says the conditions under which at the end time,
Right.
at the end time in which the ingathering after David, the ingathering of the diaspora Jews around the world was to be achieved. This is a more modern thing, but it was done, and they interpret it, say that it would be done only within a context of universal justice existent in the world, and that there would be no military force involved in that. It would be a thing totally acceptable with no damage being done to the people who were there and so forth. So they're the most anti-Zionist people in the world. And they still claim, and the Jews by and large who walk the world today still claim, that we have not had a visitation by the Messiah or the Mashiachs to come. And to the Natura Carta, it is the greatest possible heresy on the part of nationalistic-minded Jews in the modern experience after Holocaust and that, to establish the state without the leadership or without the Mashiach, and he's still not arrived.
I'm familiar with the theory.
Okay,
What's interesting is that the nature of the Messiah within the Roman patrician class was resolved. They knew who the Messiah was. All of their historians, Josephus, Tacitus, Dio, Suetonius, they all knew who the Messiah was. The Messiah was the Flavian Caesar.
Okay, that's their view.
The individual
that's
who
not
had the individual.
That's not the Judaic view.
No, of course not. But you see, the question
is
pinballed through history for 2,000 years. It'll probably never get fully resolved. But in terms of the origin of Christianity, this is such an important point, because this particular set of Caesars, they believe they had won the mantle of the Messiah as a trophy in war.
Did they use out of their ancient religious things? I mean, you think of the Constantine and that kind of thing in 300 or so, but did they have within the, because they had many ancient gods that had been part of the pantheon and so forth. Did they have within that tradition, the Roman tradition, back, the concept of Messiah? Or did the Messiah come from Judea, things borrowed from Judea or something? Or
what the Roman historians were referring to?
I mean, the precursor religions to, let's say, in the in Rome.
Well, first of all, they knew of the concept, the Judaic concept of the Messiah, because they fought against the Messianic movement, and they fought against messiahs, individual claiming to be the Messiah. So they knew all about what that individual was and how the scriptures predicted his coming.
The scriptures including the Torah.
Of course.
And that was very important to the Judaic identity.
Well, this was what the Roman historians.
And the Talmud.
This was what the Roman historians specifically stated most motivated the Jews in Israel to rebel, was the concept of the Messiah. But they said that the Jews were wrong, that the prophecies that they were referring to, Daniel, Isaiah, that those prophecies actually predicted the Roman Flavian Caesar. In other words, Titus Flavius, was the individual the scriptures predicted. This is the official position of the Roman historians. There's not a Roman historian that of the era that doesn't make that exact claim.
That's interesting. That's in the 1st century A.D.?
Yeah.
During that 1st century?
First and 2nd century. All these historians, right? Yeah.
Well, okay, that's interesting.
Okay, so
they all accepted that idea.
They all accepted it.
And
what's interesting
Gibbon talks about this and everything?
Of course, yeah. So the thing is that the citations are in existence, and all the historians, you can just go to Google them, and you can you can get it.
I understand.
But it's interesting how few people know this.
Yeah.
Because what's really important is that all of the archaeologic evidence of where Christianity originated is not in Judea; it's in Rome. It's in the catacombs. This is where the very first evidence of Christian existence comes from. Now, these catacombs still have inscriptions on them, so you can see who created them. Well, the Flavians created them. Titus Flavius's niece is Domitilla, who's one of the first saints of Christianity, is the individual who created the oldest catacomb in Rome. All of the imagery on the walls, the fish, the anchor, the star, the olive branch, these are all images from the imperial cult that worshipped the Flavian Caesars.
I had if I may,
Yep.
that's very the Flavian. I didn't realize that. It's really interesting. I have another friend of mine who told me about Mithra.
Yeah.
And that there was a Persian entity, and he claims, this is what he heard, you've studied things, so you might know more, that there was an entity, there was Persian, and he was an individual, and that he was the precursor to the monotheistic tradition, and he was in existence 2,600 years before Christ, and that it preceded the earliest Judaic experiences of Abraham down in Ur and so forth, and that Mithra came, and the characteristics of Mithra were so similar to what came to be the characteristics of Christianity that it was almost identical. He said it was a plagiarized Mithraism, which is what Christianity
I think
was one. But let me just finish,
if
you don't mind. And he said that Mithra came to be worshipped, and that the Vatican Hill in the 1st, 2nd centuries was a temple to Mithra, and there was a huge representation of religious identification with Mithraism in Rome in those early centuries before Constantine. Does that make any sense, or does that come in? Or
it's a completely correct appraisal.
So it's Mithra was being worshipped, and they had a temple on what is now the Vatican Hill, given over to Mithraism, and huge numbers of the military and the followers in Rome were devotees of Mithraism as the first monotheistic religion.
That is correct.
Out of Persia.
And there were a number of religions, of course, that were in conjunction with Mithraism. There was the cult of Isis, for example, was very popular. And then there was all these mystery religions.
Okay.
Now, the problem, of course, in linking them to Christianity is that there really isn't much known about the theology. There's not a lot of written records. If you look at Christianity, what you see is the pontiff, the sacraments, the college of the cardinals, a particular kind of authority structure from the bishops down. This is all Roman. There's no...
Before Constantine?
Oh, yes.
Oh, really?
Certainly.
Because we think of Constantine as making a conversion to Christianity and so forth. And forgive my ignorance. I'm just not...
No, it's not.
I mean, I always associate Constantine with the change in the Roman Empire writ large, Byzantine and all that, with the Christian...
He made it the
making a pact with the Roman power.
He made it the state religion.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And it's associated with the emergence of Christianity in Rome. I hadn't realized there was this Christian movement, except people that were fed to the lions.
Right.
And so forth.
Well, you see, one of the difficulties that you have in talking about Christianity is you have to remember that there was followers of a Christ simply means Messiah, in Judea from year 1 through the year 135, when most of this persecution of the Christians was supposedly taking place. And in fact, it is literally true, but they weren't Roman Christians, they were Jewish Christians. They were the followers of the Messiah in Judea that were taken to Rome and tortured and killed. The historian Josephus, who covered the war, he flatly accounts all of the followers of the Christ that they captured during the war and took to Rome and slaughtered in the Colosseum.
And the Christ being then who?
Some Jewish Messiah.
Some Jewish...
That they were following. In other words, the Messiah was a title that could be passed along generationally, perhaps, or certainly more than one individual would be able to be given the title. And so they were looking to someone who had the power of God that they would refer to as a Messiah or Christ. And this was the nature of the rebellion.
Yeah.
So that when you're taking Christians, in quotes, to Rome, of course, it's a true history, but these are not Roman Christians. Remember, the Roman Christians are tax-paying, they're peaceful. What motivation would Rome possibly have for killing these individuals? Rome was very pragmatic. The fact is that when you look at the archaeologic evidence and you see that this family, the Flavian, set up the catacombs.
Yeah, what years are we now with the Flavian?
Well, the Flavians were they were the Caesars from 70 through about 93 or 97, I believe.
And who would be involved in that?
Well, there was three of them. There was Vespasian, the father, and two sons, Titus and Domitian.
Okay.
Titus was the individual who actually set up the Gospels.
You figure him
yes, well,
prominently in the book.
Well, it's really easy to understand. I mean, Jesus talks constantly about this Son of Man who's going to come and he's going to make a visitation, and the unrepentant Jews will be killed, and he names these very specific things. Well, the victors write history.
They always do.
Okay,
yeah,
well, the Gospels are actually a military history. Jesus is naming military victories of a particular individual. When he talks about destroying the Galilean towns, or fishing for men at the Sea of Galilee, or encircling Jerusalem with a wall, or raising the temple, there's only one individual who can actually claim this, and he's Titus Flavius. And again, he is an individual who claims to be the Messiah. He isn't just someone off of the street.
He made that claim in Rome and so forth.
His historians made it for him.
His historians made it for him.
They all said that all of the Jewish scriptures predicted that a Messiah would come.
They're going to try and co-opt the Jews?
Well, they tried to, yes.
They tried to co-opt the Jews.
Of course.
That's essentially what the Christianity is.
Exactly.
That's what you're saying.
Exactly. They had a militaristic version of the religion. And
because you keep saying the Son of Man.
Sure.
I mean, I keep hearing about Jesus, the Son of God, and that there's a divine connection in the person of Jesus. That's what we get in there.
Well, we
don't usually say the Son of Man.
Well, I'm just trying to use the easiest to understand vernacular. But the fact is that when you have Jesus in the Gospels talking about his identity, his Father's identity, it's always the secret identity. No one knows my Father's identity. You don't know who I am. Right. Well, we don't know who he is. But the fact is that Titus's father was a god. He was deified as a god, and Titus had as a designation, therefore, the Son of God.
Who deified him?
The Roman Senate.
Who did the Roman Senate deify people?
Yes.
Did they deify many people? Were there a lot of gods around?
It was very interesting. They deified about half of the Caesars. About half didn't make the grade, but about half did.
Who were some of them what made the grade?
Julius Caesar, Augustus, Claudius,
Caligula?
Caligula did not.
He did not
Nero
make the
did
cut?
not.
Nero didn't make the cut?
Domitian did not. But Titus and Vespasian both did.
They made them divine.
Yes, they actually made them God. They named them God.
Had they had divine traditions out of other Germanic or other kinds of traditions and so forth, which was the religion that they had? And what did they have in pre-Judaic times? I mean, pre-Caesar times. What was the religious background, foundational background of the Roman polity?
Well, the Romans were pantheistic. I mean, they essentially borrowed the religions
like most of the world.
They borrowed essentially the religions from Greece, and they gave them Roman names, but you could see that the theology was essentially the same. When Julius became Caesar, things changed, and suddenly a human became a God, and Julius
that's a pretty big divide.
It was a big divide, and it's a big divide between a republic and the dictatorship of the Caesar.
It's another big divide.
What happened was that I presume is that these individuals realized that being a god gave them a little bit easier time maintaining the role of Caesar.
Yeah, I would think so. It would be pretty good. If
hard to rebel against someone who is
hard to go. You got the spiritual and the political.
It's
a PR thing.
Right, and so an imperial cult developed that was an enormous bureaucracy, very likely the largest bureaucracy Rome had. They had hundreds of temples and thousands of priests, and they were administered to the cult of Caesar.
We're in first century now.
First
AD.
century, right, and
AD.
in second century.
And they had temples and cults and a whole vast array of gods they were worshiping?
No, they had the gods they were worshiping were the Caesars.
The Caesars.
The imperial cult focused on the worship of the Caesars who were gods. So you would have, for example, all of the cities named in Revelation as Christian cities were very powerful cities within the imperial cult, so that the imperial cult would have temples and priests available, so that, as my theory develops, the Gospels, once they were created, could essentially be read to people who would be brought into the temple, so that when when you look at the Gospels, what they really are, essentially, is just a very straightforward declaration that the Son of Man, or the Messiah, will make a coming, right? If Jesus existed in 30 to 33...
The Son of Man, the Son of God.
Both. It's the same,
Well,
it's the same term.
Yeah, but we hear Jesus, the Son of God.
Right.
That's what we hear trippingly off the tongue,
Okay.
right? And that's a big division also, a divine thing.
As far as I'm concerned, these are just designations, but they all mean the same thing. They all mean Caesar. If you look at the Arch of Titus in Rome, which still stands, you'll see that it has, right on it, Titus, Son of God. All right.
Son of God.
Yes.
Now that sounds a little different than Son of Man. Son of Man, there's a lot of sons of man.
Right. Well, Son of Man.
That sounds like rendering unto Caesar.
The way I'm using that term is
you use it, yeah.
I use it as a messianic term.
Okay.
It comes from Daniel, and Jesus in the Gospels, when he refers to the individual who's going to do these very specific set of military achievements.
Military, there are other things too, other than military.
Oh, of course, but remember, he is doing these military achievements, right? He's going to encircle Jerusalem with a wall, he's going to raise the temple, and he's going to lay low the Galilean towns. He says the Son of Man is going to make a visitation, and he says he's going to make it before this generation passes away. The generation is 40 years because that's the designation that Moses gave because that's how long the wandering lasted, before they could go into the promised land.
I wonder what a generation would be. About 20 years.
But according to the Judaic perspective, it's 40. So that's why you see how they created the character of Jesus. The temple.
Now wait a minute, you made an assertion there. They, being the Romans,
the Roman intellectual
created
circle,
the character of Jesus. They created Jesus, and the basis of the Christianity is, in a certain sense, to be questioned in a fundamental way.
Well, they created the character as a prophet that would predict what Titus did. So because a generation is 40 years, Titus raised the temple in 70, so that 70 then would be taking you back to the beginning beginning of Jesus' ministry. Masada concluded the war in 33, and so then you would have the conclusion of Jesus' ministry on Passover 33, which was exactly 40 years from the day when Masada was destroyed. So you have these 40-year linkages between this generation. So when Jesus says the Son of Man's going to come, he tells him what the guy's going to do, and then he says it's going to happen with this very specific time span. So now you have the Roman Christ, because he is essentially taking the mantle. He shows up. Titus Flavius. He shows up.
Flavius was Christ?
Titus Flavius he is the Son of Man, or the Christ, that Jesus says is going to come and do these things.
And Jesus is a mythical thing?
Yes, he's just
created out by intellectuals?
He's like Hercules. He's just created out of literary necessity. In other words, what they did was they just invented a Judaic prophet that would predict Caesar, so that when
so Caesar could co-opt the messianic nonsense.
Exactly. And then at the same time they gave him a lot of pacifistic verbiage because they wanted to tone down the military
and cut down on the messianic movement.
Exactly. To make it calmer, to make it more, to give to Caesar.
All co-opting. They wanted to co-opt. PR.
They wanted two things. They wanted taxes and they wanted obedience.
Yeah, right.
Beyond that, not a problem.
That's a pretty strong. So in that sense, the notion of Christianity is a very different kind of route than is normally achieved, and that's a major did this happen after the resurrection, or was the resurrection Titus? Did it go up to there?
Well,
was there a person? Was there a person that was Jesus, as is in the Gospels, as Christianity understands
that individual
he didn't exist?
No. Let me just give you an example. Let me just give you a real good example.
That's a big assertion on the part. It's going to upset a number of the people watching this program, I would bet, don't you?
I think it might, but it's something that can easily be demonstrated. You simply look at where Jesus begins his ministry. It's at the Sea of Galilee. And he says, if you follow me, you will be fishers of men, right? Okay, now we just follow along with Titus Flavius's military campaign. He comes to Judea. Where does he stop first? Sea of Galilee. What does he do? Sinks the Galilean fishing fleet, and he catches the Jewish rebels, like fish. Okay, so now if you follow through the ministry, all of the episodes, when Jesus talks to the guy who has the legion of demons inside him, these are all just simply representations of military events that Titus Flavius goes through. If you follow through, you'll even come to things like, in the Gospels they have a son of Mary who is a Passover lamb, because Jesus says, take of my body, at Passover he turns himself into a Passover lamb. If you follow through with the ministry of Titus, or the campaign of Titus Flavius, you'll see that you have all of these events are taking place, and you even have a son of Mary who is a human Passover lamb at exactly the same point in this relative process as Titus does. And then following that, you have, whereas in the Gospels you then have a crucifixion in a group of three where Joseph of Arimathea takes him down from the cross and Jesus survives. You even
he went into the sepulchre. It was buried.
Right. In the Titus's campaign.
And did this mostly, his attention with the local Judaic, occur after the so-called resurrection of Jesus that was part of the Christian myth?
When these events occurred?
Yeah.
These events all occur between 70. They occur 40 years in the future. So
from
the way
it was 33
right,
that he died.
They backdated the ministry because they wanted to create a prophet. So they simply backdated the ministry to 40 years exactly away from Titus's campaign, and then linked the events to it.
I see. Of the Gospels normally understood, because what you're saying is not what's normally understood by a lot of people when they say Mark, Matthew. Which is the oldest of those? Was it written in Greek? What was it? And what were the sources of what we call the Gospels in a more traditional understanding by the large part of the Christian
There's enormous controversy over which one was written first or when they were written. Most scholars indicate that they were written following the war, because there are events from the Jewish war in the Gospels, like the raising of the temple.
That's good evidence that it followed.
So that they feel from they were written in Greek.
Mostly in Greek.
Well, that's no one's ever been able to dispute it. They've certainly never been able to find any Hebraic documents that are the Gospels. And so they were written in the era of the Flavian Caesars. So when you look at 90 or 80, when most people feel that Mark was written,
what year?
80 or 90.
And that's usually granted as the earliest?
Well, again, there's controversy. No one knows. But this is when I would say the majority of scholars would indicate that was when the Gospels.
And there were many Gospels, weren't there? And
there
only
were
certain ones have been brought into the canon.
There are only certain ones, and the reason that the Gospels that have become the canon is because those are the ones that contained the imperial cult's message for the future. Because what's really interesting about them is that they actually intended for, at some point, the Gospels to be understood. They are written in a kind of in a particular
mystery,
sort of
shrouded mystery, or
it's really just typology.
Oh, typology.
Typology. In other words, they created the ministry of Jesus as a mirror that would predict the military campaign of Titus Flavius. So not only is Jesus making these specific predictions that this Son of Man is going to do, but everything he does is a foreseeing of what Titus's campaign is.
But that was going to occur 40 years later.
Right. As Jesus says, before the generation passes away, before 40 years is over, you'll have Masada. Because
Masada was a fortress where they were attacked.
Right. And do you know it actually fell 40 years to the day from Jesus' resurrection?
That's pretty unusual, isn't it?
Very unusual.
That's some pretty good timing on the part of the people.
Well, you can see that the word...
Maybe they orchestrated that.
Well, maybe it was a divine...
Was that a false flag operation on the part of a military power?
I think what it was is just very craftsman-like literary construction.
Satirical.
It's very satirical.
Yeah.
It's very satirical. In other words, when Jesus...
I mean, your premise. And your premise is going to be doubted by a lot of people.
What you have to understand is that the Roman comedy, and these individuals are very witty, is rough. So that when Jesus says, and it's a particular kind of Roman comedy where the fool will say something that is seemingly spiritual, but there's a literal meaning that is funny. When Jesus says, you'll become fishers of men, well...
A lot of metaphor.
It's literally, if you follow the Roman Christ, you're going to be actually fishing for men.
Out of reality.
And when Jesus says, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have to remember that famine was a Roman siege weapon, and that cannibalism occurred during this
Really? I didn't- okay.
Oh yeah. Well, Josephus records it so that when you have the passage in Josephus that talks about the son of Mary who's a Passover lamb, the individual is cannibalized.
So overall, you're saying in a certain sense that Jesus, as we understood it normally in the Christian tradition and so forth, did not exist.
No, it's a literary creation.
That's what you're saying,
Yes.
right? And that the Jesus that we study and have Christmas every year,
Right.
and the crèche and all that, was a myth and a PR campaign.
It depends. In other words, the Son of Man that Jesus is envisioning, which is in fact the Christ that the individuals in the Flavian catacombs would have understood as Jesus or the Christ.
They wanted that person to be Flavius.
Right, it was Titus Flavius. So in other words, when
Bigger than Elvis.
he's lasted longer.
Yes.
When you're when you have to remember that the first saints of the Christian church, the Catholic Church, are all Flavian. You have Domitilla, Nero, Achelous, Clemens. The very first pope is Titus's nephew.
Who was the first pope?
Well, according to there's two different lineages of popes, but according to the
One in France or something?
no, that was
Another
a Middle Age schism.
Yeah, right. Sorry.
But the individual that the Acts of Nero and Achelous, which is a 5th century document that's based on earlier traditions.
5th BC.
5th CE. It's the 5th
CE.
century. Yeah.
Because I think 5th century.
All right.
I always
but
think
it's a
of
very,
Greece.
very early church document, and it claims that the individual who was given the title of pontiff or pope from Simon was Titus Flavius's nephew.
I see, all in the family.
Right, so that's Clement. He was related to Domitilla, who there is existing scriptural evidence. In other words, when you go into the oldest catacomb in Rome, you have to pass through an inscription that thanks Flavius Domitia, Titus's niece, for giving the Christian church this area for burial.
Wow.
So when you look at the archaeologic evidence, right, it not only suggests that the Flavius are involved in it. Okay, Nero's, Achelous, these are all Flavian either employees or are their family members. But you have to remember, the Flavians are flatly, through their historians, saying we are the Christ. The Flavian Caesar is the Christ. So when you consider, well, who do these individuals think was the Son of Man who came to Galilee and laid that place flat, who encircled Jerusalem with the wall, who raised the temple? There's only one individual in history.
Flavius.
It's Uncle Titus.
Oh, Titus, yeah.
They knew.
Uncle Titus.
They knew at least, perhaps not the hoi polloi, perhaps not but certainly the administrators. They knew who the Son of Man, the Messiah, the Christ was. They knew it's Titus.
How's your book been received by traditional Christians?
Not well.
I would think not. I think you'd probably get a lot of problems with this.
Right.
A lot of people saying it's obviously Jesus.
It's a shame because this is really important information. It's so easy to verify. In other words, there's a lot of speculations and kind of wild theories about Christian origins that are based on really weak evidence and are non-existent, just conjecture. But what I'm saying is that with the existing histories, with the Gospels themselves, and with the history of Titus's campaign, you can come to a complete understanding, a very simple, clear understanding of how the religion began. There's no question the Flavians produced the Gospels. And they did so on the surface level to create a pacifistic religion, but they also wanted to document that their family had defeated the Messianic movement, and therefore they had become the Christ.
And kept that in check and that kind of thing.
Right. So it's twofold.
So that became Christianity.
That became Christianity, and that's why when you look at the pontiff, you see well, who is the pontiff? The Pope. The pontiff is the head of the imperial cult. The pontiff at the time where the temple was raised was Titus Flavius. He was the pontiff. The Caesar often took that title. So that when you actually look at the archaeology, not the hocus pocus people talking about, there was a Paul had a community here, or Mark was, here, or there was a James.
Isn't there an awful lot of research around these people?
There's a lot of research. There's
a lot of theological speculation.
Just no evidence.
And all kinds. No evidence.
Just no archaeology.
There's no evidence for the existence of Jesus.
Nothing.
There's no evidence to support the Christian in the traditional way.
There isn't. But
that's a pretty strong and earth-shattering.
Well, there are no, other than the Gospels, you have no first century documentation, but you do have documentation of the Flavian family. You do have documentation that they claim to be the Christ. You have absolute documentation that they fulfilled all of the prophecies that the Jesus in the Gospel. And we know the victors write history.
But the prophecies are coming out of a prophetic tradition that is Judaic.
Well,
and the Torah.
But you see that
and the idea
that's
and the
the
evolution.
Tradition, but that's not the words of Jesus. Jesus is very anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
He talks about the Jews as being very wicked. He talks about them that they need to repent. Well, what was the sin?
He talks about the Jews that way.
Yeah,
He was
absolutely.
a Jew.
He claims to be a Jew.
And he threw the money changers out of the temple and that sort of thing. And that was when he got really angry and that kind of stuff.
Right. Well, he threw the thieves out of the temple.
Yeah.
Because
it might be a lot of people the way Mr. would feel about Mr. Bush now.
Of course.
Yeah, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So the people in power are to be questioned. The people in power at that moment were of Jews.
Well, you have to remember
the Jews are associated with the money lenders in the temple.
Well, just let me explain that particular passage in the Gospel. Jesus comes in and the temple is being polluted, and he calls them, and he uses a very specific word for thieves. It's a Greek word, and
what is it? Do you know?
I can't pronounce it.
Okay.
I could. But give me a second. It'll come anyway.
It's got an os on the end.
When Titus shows up. He has the same situation. The temple has been taken over by a group, and he uses the same word that is used in the Gospel, this particular word for a kind of thief.
I see, yeah.
So that when you go through Jesus' ministry, all of the problems that he faces are the same ones that Titus faces. In other words, Jesus faces the thieves who've taken over the temple. Titus has the same experience. So that's why the literary character of Jesus has that experience in the temple.
Oh, I see, yeah.
Yeah, so all of these experiences of Jesus are in fact just representations of the military campaign.
It's a really interesting thesis, and in the book and everything, one of the problems, we could talk for about 20 hours easy and that kind of thing. Maybe we will over coffee or something, but anyway, the point is that I think we have a roll-in piece of footage that you have about this, a 5-minute piece of video that we want to try and get in.
Okay.
So maybe we could set that up. I'm not exactly sure what's on it, but in the control room, maybe we could set up the piece that is to be inserted. I think it's about a 5-minute piece that talks to some of these issues.
That's right,
illuminates them.
Yes.
And so forth. So if you could run that piece now then, please, and let me know when it's going, please.
First, point that someone really has to recognize, and it's strangely not well understood by the general populace, is that there was a messianic movement in Palestine at the time that Christianity is supposedly emerging, which is completely militaristic. It was the basis of the rebellion against the Roman Empire, and this point is is critical in understanding the era and understanding the religious context that Christianity comes from, because the people in this movement were Christians in the sense that they followed a Christ. The word Christ simply means Messiah. So that for one thing, when you discuss Christians being taken to Rome and killed in the Colosseum, when people criticize my theory, one of the things that they often bring up is that, look, the Romans were attacking the Christians. They were, killing the Christians. How could they possibly be promoting Christianity? And the reason they even ask the question is because they are sort of unfamiliar with the history, that there was a movement of Christians that was militaristic, that the historians of the era record as having been captured, being brought to Rome, and actually killed in the Colosseum. So that's the real Christian-Roman relationship, is one of a military movement and an occupying army.
So you're saying that the Christians who were persecuted were the Messianic Jewish movement?
Exactly, and you see, even you can see in your question that it's difficult even to talk about it because of the semantical problem of what the word Christian means. But that's exactly what I'm saying. Is that the one of the elements of the creation of Christianity, that the Roman Jews, was to essentially steal the history of the real Messianic movement. In my book, I show that, for example, the Apostle Simon or Peter, his history of being taken, to Rome and being executed, is actually stolen in the Christian Gospels. They take that character and make him an apostle of the Christ. And at the end of the Gospels, Jesus predicts that Simon is going to be taken to Rome and given a death to glorify God. And this is literally true, but the individual that he's speaking to is not, at that particular moment anyway, a Roman Christian, but he's one of the Jewish Christians who is in fact fighting against Rome. The Gospels are very delicate literature, very, very finely tuned literature. One of the purposes to try to absorb the history of the real Messianic movement and make it the history of Christianity that is being controlled by Rome, so that it makes more believable in terms of its historical basis.
Okay, so who were the apostles?
These are images, literary images of the Maccabees. If you look at the names of the apostles, you'll see the names of the Maccabees pop up. You have Simon, John, Judas, Matthew. And what the Gospels are doing is they're trying to show that this history of the Maccabees, who were essentially the family that was leading the struggle against Rome, became these docile, pacifistic followers of the Prince of Peace. The purpose of the Gospels is, on one level, is to simply try to pacify the Messianic movement, which was militaristic. And so that's why they borrowed these histories. They kind of, they used some of the truth, and then they also added on the version of reality that they wanted, so that the eventual followers of the religion would be pacifistic and pay their taxes.
The thing is, when we bring it up to date or something like that, within scientific understanding, we've been here 200,000 years as a species, and we've been through a long period of time. And it's interesting to me, we got reverberation. You might want to turn, okay, if you could turn it down here. We got reverberation in here. If you could turn it down, please. That there was, we begin with Mithra, and then we have these religions and so forth, and then we have this messianic tradition and the idea of the Messiah, somebody who is going to, a Mashiach that's going to come, and it's presaging, in a certain sense, a time when, unlike James Joyce, who says history is a nightmare from which we're attempting to awaken, that there will be a time when there will be justice and an appropriate order, and not the law of the jungle, coming out of a historical evolutionary process and so forth. And we get to a point, and it's interesting to me that Judaic people do not say that the Messiah was the Christian, whether it was Jesus or that was the time. And it was not possible for you to see it in those terms of there being that time until perhaps now. We reach a point now with our extended capability where we can destroy, apparently, it has to be modeled, the whole species with the weapons that we developed finally to get out of the killer. I'm not sure of that. It might be somebody would survive in a New Guinea cave or something, but it looks like we got that Promethean power. We also have a power to overcome the ancient scourges and also the knowledge. We're in a certain sense coming to the end of 200,000. We may be coming to what would be the conditions of justice. We saw President Carter, on the other hand, on the television saying, do you think we live in a just world? And he said, of course not. We've all been the strong, we're lording over the weak, and we haven't had a situation where there was enough or where there was a condition that would allow for real justice to appear. The Jews who held on to the idea, you call this justice, you call this a messianic condition that we live in. We've been killing each other with regularity, alarming regularity, throughout the whole of human history from 2,000 years ago up to the present. This may be a time when we're coming to a time where there will be a qualitative transformation that's growing out of our technological capability to provide. This may be a time of when justice could, the conditions that could allow for justice are a precursor to establishing a situation on planet Earth that is adequate to what the future requires. These may be messianic times in now in terms of our capability.
Messianic and perhaps the
in the sense that the Torah, at least, they say that it will be created in a condition, the end time will be created in a condition of universal justice.
Right.
And we may have the capability of achieving that in a way that simply could not even be dreamed of 2,000 years ago, much less, that this may be a time of qualitative transformation. Maybe we're coming to a new relationship to the cosmos, consciousness. We may be transcending the human condition. There was a consciousness prior to Homo sapien along the hominoid line, and then there was a qualitative. We may be coming to a new relationship or a liberated relationship that the prophetic tradition of the Messiah, Mashiach, was heralding or was presaging, and it may be coming now.
My feeling is that the political powers have been able to use religion as a bulwark of their control.
Well, Marx called it the opium of the people.
Right, and I think that we desperately need to transition into a less hostile,
liberated.
Well, I'm not sure what word you want to use, but it is simply the case that the ability to make weapons of mass destruction is going up and is becoming easier and easier, and it's easy to imagine in several decades that individuals and groups could be able to produce such devices.
We couldn't do it in the Second World War. We didn't have the capability.
Would have been difficult.
We do now.
We do now.
Apparently.
But
so that's existentially new in the evolution
of
consciousness.
And because of that, the devices that have led to so many of our wars, ethnicity and religion,
and material scarcity,
and of
injustice
course
that grows out of that.
Right, all of the things.
We may be transcending that in terms of our
I would just say that we need to work on the problem rapidly, because we, I am pessimistic. I do not see the arc of wisdom is accelerating as quickly as the capacity to produce weapons of mass destruction.
Couldn't agree with you more. Where the heck is the vision now?
And where's the
Mashiach?
Where is he? Right.
Yeah.
I don't think he's coming. I think we're going to have to work out this problem ourselves, and I think that we need as much good information to make good choices, and that's why one of the reasons I felt responsible to bring out the book. I have no agenda against Christianity per se. I just think it produces very irrational thinking, and it's easy for government leaders to use. That's how the religion was designed, was to be used by the government to control the masses, and so I just think that we're past the point we can operate in that way. Well, we've got to try to move beyond it.
Really good to have a thesis that you put forth. It's very interesting. Makes people think a great deal, and I appreciate it very much. The book coming in to Manhattan Network and conversation.
It's been my pleasure.
Meeting. Let's stay in touch and everything, and everything. And it's been your pleasure to have Perceptions in. Let's show it one more time. We've got some time. It's called Caesar's Messiah. Subtitle being again, Joe, help me out.
The Roman Conspiracy to Invent Jesus.
That's a very